This is Israel, one of the world's smallest and youngest states. It lies on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Historically, it was a crossroads country that lay between major trade centers. Yet the events that take place in Israel often have repercussions that spread throughout the Middle East and sometimes throughout the world. For more than 50 years, violent conflict has rocked Israel. Israel and its neighbors have fought several times. Tension between Israelis and the Palestinians erupts in bloody violence on a regular basis. Much of the conflict in this part of the Middle East stems from the fact that both Israeli Jews and Arab Palestinians feel that they have ancient claims to the same small piece of land. In 1948, Israel was carved out of the country of Palestine, the home of the Palestinians. Israel became a Jewish homeland. Most Palestinians now live in areas called the occupied lands, which are controlled by Israel.
We have not lived anywhere else. We are a people that descends from a very immense and complex historical relations. We have become, we live at a crossroads of the world, and many different nations have had interests in our homeland throughout the history. So we've had conquest after conquest after conquest, but we take pride in our survival.
Israelis base their claim on that of the Hebrews who came to the region, which was then called Canaan, some 3,000 years ago.
According to the book of Genesis, in chapter 12, a covenant was established between God and Abraham, and the covenant was triangular. It was between God, Abraham and his descendants, and it specified a particular piece of land.
But other peoples already occupied this land, some of them the ancestors of the modern-day Palestinians. In fact, there were always people who lived in Canaan and then Palestine who were not Hebrews or Jews.
The country is based on its history, not 200 years of its history. So if everyone who lived in Palestine would make a claim to Palestine, then many other nations besides the Jews could make a claim to Palestine.
After the Israelites, as the early Jews were called, settled in the region that was then called Canaan, they conquered it piece by piece. About 1000 BCE, the Jewish King David unified the Jewish tribes, defeated the Israelites' enemies, and established the Kingdom of Israel. He made Jerusalem the capital of the state. Ancient Israel was invaded many times by Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The Jews revolted many times, and their conquerors expelled many Jews from the country. In the 2nd century BCE, the Romans took over most of the Middle East, including the region they called Palestine. Jews in Palestine rebelled again and again. After many revolts, the Romans drove the Jews out of Jerusalem and destroyed the city. Many Jews fled the country. By the 4th century, Christianity had spread throughout the Roman lands, and Palestine, like the rest of the Roman Empire, became a Christian country. About 610, a religious prophet named Muhammad emerged in what is now Saudi Arabia. He preached that there is only one God, Allah, and that he was Allah's messenger. The religion Muhammad preached is called Islam, and its followers are Muslims. The Muslims of the Arabian Peninsula swept through the Middle East, North Africa, and even into Spain. And many people in the Arab Empire, including most of the Palestinians, converted to Islam. The Palestinians of today are still mostly Muslims, while the Israelis are mostly Jews. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Turks conquered Palestine and other Arab lands. Palestine began 4 centuries under Ottoman domination. Although the Ottoman Turks also converted to Islam, the Arab Muslims wanted to rule themselves. In the 1700s and 1800s, Europeans gained influence in the Middle East and North African lands that had been part of the Ottoman Empire. The Europeans wanted some control of the Mediterranean Sea and the trade routes with the East that ran through the Middle East. European interest in the region increased even more when the Suez Canal opened in 1869, providing a passage between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. The canal shortened the distance between England and India by 6,000 miles. Despite the European presence, however, Palestine and some other Arab countries remained under Ottoman control. The Arabs did not want to be ruled by either Europe or the Turks. Their best chance for independence did not come until World War I. But by then, another people, the Jews, were restaking their claim to Palestine. Most Jews who had left Palestine eventually settled in Europe. Because the Jews had different customs and beliefs, many Christians distrusted and mistreated them. Jews were barred from many jobs and often could live only in certain areas.
The amount of discrimination and restriction and persecution that the Jews experienced primarily in Europe in the Middle Ages up to the modern times is hard for a person living in the United States and knowing that our government is non-religious based and non-discriminatory. It's hard to understand. But in every state in Europe, the country was run by some aspect of religion. The Jews were restricted in where they could live, how they could educate, what they could do, and where they could go.
Despite this prejudice, some Jews came to hold high places in government, science, and other fields. But the Jews were never completely safe. They were expelled from France and England in the 13th century and from Spain in the 15th century. Europeans blamed them for the Black Death in the 14th century, and thousands of Jews were killed. In the late 19th century, the Russian government encouraged attacks called pogroms on Jewish communities. At this time, a number of Jews began to feel they needed their own country in order to be safe. Some Eastern European Jews chose to settle in Palestine because they considered that region to be an ancient Jewish homeland.
Palestinians in general, when Jewish immigration started directing to going to Palestine, Palestinians in general were not resistant to it, but became resistant to it when the political dimension of that immigration became clear to the Palestinians, when it became apparent to them that this immigration is directed at establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine and denying their representation.
In 1897, some Jews founded the World Zionist Organization. Zion is the name of a hill in Jerusalem, and the purpose of the Zionist organization was to establish a Jewish home in Palestine. Zionists set up a fund to acquire land for the organization, and waves of Jewish immigrants began to settle in Palestine. Theodor Herzl was the organization's first president, and Baron Edmund de Rothschild, a member of a French banking family, raised money for the Zionists. The World Zionist Organization bought land in Palestine from wealthy Arabs who mostly lived elsewhere, and from poorer Palestinian Arabs who needed the money. Zionist Jews established kibbutzim, or community farms, on these lands. In 1908, the immigrants founded the city of Tel Aviv, the home of Israel's government today.
The whole legal ownership and entitlement to land through land deeds was a European system being introduced to Palestinians. Palestinians traditionally owned land collectively by the village or the family or the Bedouin tribe and so on, and they would harvest, they would cultivate and harvest these lands collectively,
One of the things that has to be understood from a land usage basis is the fact that every place the Jews went into Palestine was legal. And what I mean by that is that there was an organization established in Europe called the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund raised money and purchased land to be used by these Zionists, or by these settlers, or by these immigrants. The land was not owned by the people who lived on the land. There were Palestinians, primarily Arabs, who lived in villages, lived in towns, lived in settlements that were owned by absentee landlords, primarily from the Ottoman Empire, and they paid rent, sometimes with money, sometimes with produce, and it was this land that was then sold by the landowner that the Jewish immigrants bought. And so, as a result thereof, those who had lived on the land, sometimes for generations, had to abandon the land, had to move away. And that is the beginning, really, of the tension that we find right now of people who felt that by living on the land, they had the right to continue to live on the land, where Jewish people felt, we purchased this land, it is ours. And so there was the beginning of a conflict at that particular time in history.
Some of the landlords used the system, the legal system, and their positions in governments, previous governments, and registered plots of lands to their names because the farmers refused to register those lands. Those are the ones who sold some of their lands or some of the registered lands to their names to the Jewish National Fund. Those people were, in the first place, were not the rightful owners of the land. The other thing that needs to be, we need to bring attention to is that the fraction of lands that were used by Jewish immigrants and Israelis today that were purchased through this system from the absentee landlords is a very small fraction of the land that were made available to Jewish immigrants. Most of the lands that were made available to the Jewish immigrants were forcefully confiscated by the State of Israel from the Palestinians.
In 1914, World War I began, and events during the war sparked new hope among Zionists that Palestine would become theirs. The war also raised hopes among Arabs that the foreign rulers would be driven out. Turkey sided with Germany in the war against Great Britain, France, and Italy. The European allies offered independence to the Arab countries if they helped fight against Turkey. Great Britain also wanted support from European and American Jews. So, in December 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour pledged British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine that would not violate, quote, the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish community, end quote. This paper, called the Balfour Declaration, was in the form of a letter to Baron Rothschild. The British statement of support for a Jewish national home increased Jewish immigration to Palestine, although many Palestinians felt that the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine did indeed violate their rights. However, the British didn't really intend that a Jewish homeland would be established immediately after the war, nor did the Europeans intend that the Palestinians would soon have their own state. Despite such promises to Jews and to Arabs, Britain and France secretly divided most of the Arab lands between themselves. When Turkey and its allies lost the war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and the European nations took over the Middle East. The newly formed League of Nations gave Britain a mandate, or control, over Palestine.
After World War I, that entire area of Palestine was no longer under Turkish domain, but rather it was now under the authority of the British. And the British were Western, and they understood the idea of democracy, and they understood the idea of autonomy. And so when the political reality of that area of land changed, the dream of being independent and autonomous and self-governing arose.
Zionists quickly stepped up immigration to Palestine. The British ignored the Palestinians' demands for independence. Palestinians grew increasingly bitter toward the Jewish immigrants and the British. The British used military force to stop Palestinian riots against the Jewish settlers, and in the 1920s, the Jews in Palestine formed an underground military organization.
The intention of the earliest immigrants to Palestine, Jewish early immigrants to Palestine, was to just quietly settle, to go about their business, to raise their families, to have an income, to create centers of life and learning. They didn't go there with the intent of being oppressors. They didn't go there with the intent of being a military force. They just wanted to simply live quietly and do their thing. Those people whom they encountered were people who were extremely upset that a new group of individuals who had no tie to the land, at least not for the last 1900 years, were there and were displacing them. The result was, and I don't blame the Arabs for reacting this way, the result was that there was animosity between the two groups and danger in terms of the settlers. And what the settlers realized was the fact that they had to protect themselves for fear of either being killed or pushed off or destroyed. And so therein lies the beginning of what ultimately becomes a military force for the protection of the Jewish people and their property.
In 1936, several Palestinian groups joined forces and organized a national revolt.
The 1936 strike first was sparked by the workers at the Jaffa port when they discovered a Jewish immigrant ship was loaded with weapons. That news first sparked a strike at the port, and then the strike spread throughout the country.
The strikers had three basic demands: the end of Jewish immigration, an end to all further land sales to the Jews, and the establishment of an Arab national government. The Arabs refused to do business with the Jews. The revolt lasted for 3 years and nearly paralyzed the country economically. The Palestinian revolt, coming at a time when Great Britain was preparing for the possibility of another war, led the British to rethink their policy in Palestine. Great Britain depended on Middle Eastern oil and needed Arab goodwill. And the other Arab countries would side with the Palestinians. So the British put restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. These restrictions came at a time when Jews felt more than ever that they needed a safe haven. In 1933, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party took over Germany. One of their goals was to eliminate all of the Jews in Europe. The Nazis restricted, imprisoned, and killed Jews in Germany, and then in the nations Germany took over in World War II. 6 million European Jews died, many in Nazi concentration camps. This attempt to murder all the Jews is known as the Holocaust.
During World War II, when the Nazis came to power, there was literally no place for the Jews to go. There were quota restrictions in the United States for fear that the United States would be overrun by immigrants who would need assistance. Prior to 1922, America could absorb immigrants because we had an industrial revolution that required a lot of cheap, uneducated labor. But by 1922, there was a fear that the United States would be overrun, so there were quotas passed, and it allowed only a certain number of people from any country to immigrate to the United States. So the fact that Jews could not immigrate to the United States was, again, not anti-Semitic, but rather part of an overall national policy. Jews were also not permitted in a lot of other countries, not because of indiscriminate quota laws, but rather because there was a lot of anti-Semitism going around the world at this particular time. And Jews also were prohibited from entering into Israel in any great numbers, but rather they had to kind of sneak in under the cover of darkness, because if they were caught, the British would arrest them and export them to Cyprus or some other location. But a lot of Jews, kind of figured out how to get around the British, and so as many as possible found salvation in Palestine. The sad part is that the majority of Jews did not, and the result is that 6 million Jews were killed in Europe during the Nazi period.
During this time, foreign nations often turned away ships carrying Jewish refugees. 2 ships barred by the British from docking in Palestine sank, killing almost everyone on board. During World War II, some Jews formed groups to fight against the British in Palestine. These groups hated the British presence even more after the refugee ships were turned away. The discovery of the Nazi death camps at the end of World War II and the undecided future of European Jews led to increased support from European nations and the United States for a Jewish state. After World War II, militant Jewish groups attacked British offices in Palestine, Jewish immigration continued, and the Arab states protested against the growing number of Jewish settlements. Great Britain handed the Palestine problem to the newly formed United Nations to solve. In August 1947, the UN Special Committee on Palestine recommended the partition of the country into an Arab state and a Jewish state. 2/3 of the UN General Assembly approved this plan in November 1947. The Arab countries voted against it.
The UN plan failed for various reasons. The Palestinians did not see any fairness in the plan, in that, as I said, by 1947 the Jewish ownership was only 6% of the land, and the United Nations allotted 54% of the land to a Jewish state, and 46% to Palestinian state. The other thing, that there was no reason for a Palestinian to endorse such a plan, because the whole region was going through a campaign for liberation from colonialism. And this was not viewed that Palestine should be treated any different. That why should we, the Palestinians, share our homeland or split our homeland in two or so, when we are just like anybody else? They're trying to get rid of colonialism from our homeland. So the Palestinians did not see any justification.
The Arabs did not think that the General Assembly had the right to divide a country against the wishes of the majority of its inhabitants. In 1947, there were 1.3 million Arabs and only 678,000 Jews in Palestine. The Jews, who owned only about 7% of the land, gained more than half the territory in the split. And Palestinians wondered why Europeans were making them pay for the persecution of Jews in Europe.
We feel that we had no part in atrocities committed against the Jews in Europe. These conflicts were European conflicts between Jewish communities in Europe and European societies, and should have been solved there. We feel that we were made to pay for it unjustly, and I think that today both, not just us paying for it, us and the Israelis.
Violence between Arabs and Jews continued after the UN approved the partition plan. The militant Jewish groups bought large shipments of arms from Czechoslovakia. After the weapons were delivered in March 1948, the Jews attacked Arab settlements and set up communications links among Jewish communities in preparation for future battles. In April 1948, members of two Jewish militant groups, the Irgun and the Stern Gang, raided the Arab village of Deir Yassin near Jerusalem. The gangs killed between 120 and 250 Arab civilians during this raid. As the news of the Deir Yassin massacre spread, thousands of frightened Arabs fled from areas with large Jewish populations. By the end of 1948, more than 60% of the Palestinian population was made homeless and exiled out of their homeland. The United Nations called for Israel to allow for their return in Resolution 194, but Israel ignored this demand.
By May 15th, when the Arab countries declared war on the newly formed State of Israel that declared independence on May 15th, 1948, the Jewish militia that was present in Palestine at the time had forced the vast majority of the Palestinian population out of their homes. The two most populous Palestinian cities of Haifa and Jaffa were evacuated from their inhabitants. Over 400 Palestinian villages were evacuated from their inhabitants and their population were displaced. That campaign of ethnic cleansing and clearing the Palestinians out of Palestine took place prior to what Israel calls the War of Independence. And that's the primary source of conflict, is that the Palestinians were displaced out of their homeland and a whole and new construction of a Jewish nation was established in their place.
Great Britain had set May 15, 1948, as the date for ending its mandate of Palestine. The Jews, under the leadership of David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, proclaimed the independent state of Israel on May 14th.
Prior to 1948, Judaism meant a religion. It meant a religion that was in relationship with God, that was defined by prayer and defined by lifestyle. But it was not defined by a nation. There was no homeland for the Jewish people. Jews were either welcome in some countries or unwelcome in other countries. The United States and Canada happened to be two countries that welcomed Jews without any restriction and in a loving and meaningful way. That's not true of Europe, and never was until the modern period. And there was no homeland for a Jew. So a Jew just was a citizen of a country and had rights or lacked rights by virtue of the country that the Jews lived in. Once there was a homeland for the Jewish people, 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, it redefined what Judaism was and where Judaism could feel completely at ease. So for the first time in modern history, in 1948, there was a country that was run by Jewish ideals and values, that was a democracy, that allowed citizenship, that allowed for language and for culture and for history, all of which were incorporated into a country.
Israel granted them citizenship, but it's not a simple thing for the Palestinians. They had to take it, the citizenship, but the citizenship in a state that is Jewish. Its flag is Jewish, its name is Jewish, its national holiday is Jewish, its national language is Jewish, and they are Palestinians. They are not able to express themselves or express their culture, so they are in a state that denies basically their existence.
On May 15th, military forces from 7 Arab countries invaded Israel. Israeli forces were prepared for this attack. They had weapons and communication lines and some 25,000 World War II veterans. In general, the Arab countries, which had only recently gained independence, had new governments. The Arab units were small and ill-equipped. The war between Israelis and Arabs, which the Israelis considered their war for independence, ended with truce agreements signed in mid-1949. However, there was no formal peace treaty because the Arab nations refused to recognize the existence of the State of Israel. In the war, Israel took over about half of the land set aside for a Palestinian state. Egypt and Jordan seized much of the rest. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, frightened for their lives, fled to the parts of Palestine taken over by Egypt and Jordan. Israel claimed homes and farms abandoned by Palestinians. Many Arabs had expected that the Middle East and North Africa would all become part of a large Arab state. And the very existence of Israel, a non-Muslim state in the Middle East, angered them. They felt resentment that Western nations had carved up Palestine against the wishes of the Arab nations and against the rights of Palestinians. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had lost their homes. The Palestinian refugee camps were scenes of misery and discontent.
For the refugees, there were total displacement. They lost their livelihood. They moved from cities, from villages, from farmers, from shop owners, from educators, from lawyers, to be in a refugee camp with a tent, with nothing else, with no belonging, no knowledge of how life is going to turn out to be, no sense of future, no certainty. So their livelihood have been destroyed.
In the 1950s, an Egyptian leader arose who revived the dream for a unified Arab state. This dream led to 2 wars between Arabs and Israelis. The Egyptian leader's name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. At that time, Britain had troops in Egypt and controlled the Suez Canal. Nasser forced Britain to remove its troops in 1954. And in 1956, he nationalized the Suez Canal, taking it from its British and French owners. Great Britain and the United States had reneged on promises to finance the Aswan Dam, a dam on the Nile River. Nasser wanted to use fees for use of the canal to pay for the dam. Israel considered the British troops to be a buffer between Israel and Egypt and wanted the soldiers back in Egypt. The British and French wanted control of the Suez Canal again, not only for the fees, but also because it was an important passage to India. Since Egypt was encouraging Palestinian Arabs in the Gaza Strip to raid Israel, Israel felt justified in striking back. On October 29, 1956, Israeli troops invaded the Sinai Peninsula. The next day, Britain and France offered to temporarily occupy the canal zone and suggested a 10-mile buffer on either side that would separate the Egyptian forces from the Israelis. Nasser refused, and on October 31st, British and French forces attacked Egypt. Within a few days, Israeli forces occupied most of the Sinai. Then the French and British took over the Suez Canal area. Finally, after intense pressure from the United States, the European powers agreed to a ceasefire and left the canal area. In 1957, international pressure forced Israel to withdraw its troops from Sinai. Nevertheless, the raids on Israel from Gaza ceased, and UN peacekeeping forces separated Egypt and Israel. The crisis, however, helped make Nasser the most idolized Arab leader of his time. Egypt had defied the Europeans and still held the Suez Canal. Britain and France lost any Arab allies they had. Nasser was not able to establish a unified Arab state, but Egypt signed a defense agreement with Syria in 1966. This alliance brought these countries into another war with Israel. In the 1960s, Palestinian guerrillas were using camps in Jordan and Syria as a base for raids in Israel. Israeli leaders threatened to invade Syria if these guerrilla raids did not stop. In 1967, Nasser believed that Israel was preparing to invade Syria. In May, he declared that he was closing the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping, a measure that Israel declared to be an act of war. Then the king of Jordan, sensing his country would become involved in the impending conflict, signed a military alliance with Egypt. In response to Nasser's announcement, Israel launched attacks on Egypt, Jordan, and Syria on the morning of June 5, 1967. Israel quickly destroyed most of Egypt's combat aircraft, many still on the ground. Israeli ground forces started a lightning strike into Sinai, and by June 8th, they had reached the Suez Canal. By June 11th, the Arab defeat was total. Israel held all of historic Palestine, as well as Sinai and part of the Golan Heights of Syria. This brief fight is called the Six-Day War.
The Six-Day War was important to Palestinians that it changed their outlook towards the future. After the Six-Day War, Palestinians realized that the Arab regimes are incapable of addressing their concerns. They are going to be incapable of allowing them to return to their homelands. So this resulted in the Palestinians taking matters into their own hands.
In November, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 242, which emphasized, quote, the inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by war, unquote. The resolution called for Israel to withdraw, quote, from territories occupied in the recent conflict. Israel refused. These areas are now called the occupied lands.
The saddest part of modern Israel history is the occupied territories. Israel did not intend initially to maintain all of that land. They only wanted to maintain a sense of security. And so Israel consciously did not incorporate any of that land into its international borders. It administered the land because it could not achieve a peace with any of the nations around it.
Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians live in the occupied lands, many in poverty in refugee camps. Israel had decisively won the Six-Day War, but its refusal to withdraw from the captured territories angered the Arab nations. They resented that Israel, with the support of the West, could take over territory in their midst. The Six-Day War set the stage for decades of bitter conflict between Arabs and Israelis. And some Palestinians, who were still denied their own state, began their own struggle to regain a homeland.